Good morning, everyone. I think we'll just get started. So thanks for joining what is the final session in our FS Academy Summer Series. And today we will be discussing the government's Economic Crime Plan 2, which was published earlier this year. And just before I begin, there's a few housekeeping rules. Please keep your cameras off and your microphones on mute throughout the session. If you have any questions or comments after today's session, then please feel free to get in touch, either with myself or our other speaker, Sylvia, and we'll be more than happy to speak to you. This session will be recorded and sent round to you all afterwards. So with that out of the way, let's get started. So on the 30th of March this year, the UK government published the Economic Crime Plan 2 for 2023 to 2026, which I'll refer to throughout this session as the plan. The aim of the plan is to build on the first economic crime plan of 2019 to 2022, which was published back in 2019. And to set the need for the plan in context, as the plan states, economic crime poses a significant threat to the UK's national security and prosperity. The definition of economic crime is set out on the slide, and it's taken from the plan itself. Economic crime encompasses a broad category of activity involving money, finance, or assets, the purpose of which is to unlawfully obtain a profit or advantage for the perpetrator or to cause loss to others. In the plan, the government highlights the damage that economic crime can cause, and it cites that over £100 billion is thought to be laundered in the UK each year, and with fraud accounting for 41% of all crime. The government also highlights that money laundering underpins organised crime, including the drugs trade and human trafficking, and Russia's invasion of Ukraine has exemplified the growing criminal threat posed by kleptocracies. So there's clearly a need for a more robust framework in place to tackle economic crime. Just moving on to the next slide. As mentioned, the first economic crime plan was published in 2019, and this was really the first time that the government, law enforcement, supervisory agencies and the private sector had got together to jointly develop and deliver a shared strategy. And the Economic Crime Plan 2 seeks to build on the foundations of its predecessor and to focus more directly on impact and outcomes, noting that the threat from economic crime continues to grow. And the Economic Crime Plan 2 has three main tangible outcomes, which are set out on the slide. It's committed to reduce money laundering and recover more criminal assets, combat kleptocracy and drive down sanctions evasion, and lastly, cut fraud. And the government's proposed 6 key ideas to help achieve these outcomes. So it talks a lot about investing in people and technology. And one notable point that the government sets out is its intention to recruit 475 new financial crime investigators dedicated to tackling money laundering and asset recovery across different teams. The government also intends to invest in new state-of-the-art technology and to align priorities between public and private sectors in order to maximise resources. In terms of funding, the plan is underpinned by £400 million of investment. This funding represents £200 million of government investment and £200 million from the Economic Crime Anti-Money Laundering Levy. And this levy is to be paid by firms which are subject to the money laundering regulations. This £400 million figure might seem high, but there has been a lot of commentary and criticism with regards to whether it's enough. A lot of experts have said that the plan is underfunded and is not commensurate with the estimated £290 billion that fraud and money laundering is costing us annually. In order to meet its outcomes, the plan sets out various commitments, and we'll go on to discuss some key elements of these commitments. The plan is 90 pages long, so it's quite a substantial read. We've by no means endeavoured to cover all points within it, but rather we've picked out some highlights. And I will focus on outcome 1 of the plan, which is to reduce money laundering and recover more criminal assets. The plan discusses the fact that the UK is an attractive jurisdiction for money laundering perpetrators, and the scale of the threat is growing as criminals exploit available technology to communicate, commit crimes and hide their profits. There are various proposals set out in the plan to tackle money laundering, and I'll go through some of these, starting with limiting abusive corporate structures. And if we can, oh, we're on the next slide, thanks. So the plan notes that alongside UK companies, the use of overseas corporate entities and trusts remains an attractive method to launder illicit funds, particularly in the purchase of UK property, which faces a high risk from money laundering. Last year, the government introduced the Register of Overseas Entities, which requires overseas companies to reveal the real identities of their owners, including where a trust is part of the structure, to make sure that criminals can't hide behind chains of shell companies, and therefore making it harder to launder illicit funds through the UK property market. In order to take steps to identify rogue structures more quickly and effectively, the government plans to take action through the Economic Crime and Corporate Transparency Bill. This will see the reform of the role of Companies House and will provide the Registrar of Companies with enhanced powers, enabling it to become what the plan calls a more active gatekeeper over company creation and a custodian of more reliable data concerning companies and partnerships. So Companies House will be able to verify the identities of those setting up, managing and owning companies, use enhanced intelligence capabilities to challenge and reject information filed with it, and proactively share information where it has evidence of suspicious filings or behaviour. And these reforms will constitute the most significant changes to the UK's framework for registering companies in the last 170 years. Timescales for completion of the legislation underpinning the reform of Companies House will depend on when the Economic Crime and Corporate Transparency Bill is granted royal assent. This is expected to happen shortly, as it's just had its third reading last week and is now at its final stages. So moving on to the next slide. With regards to increasing effectiveness of the AML and CTF regime. So the UK's anti-money laundering and counter-terrorist financing AML CTF regulatory regime is a critical component of the fight against economic crime. The plan states that a recent review of the current regime found that improvements have been made since the implementation of the Money Laundering Regulations 2017, the MLRs. The government states that it's confident that most of the requirements and provisions currently in the MLRs are the right ones. However, while improvements have been made, the government is clear that further reform of the AML CTF supervisory regime is required. And the government sets out in the plan that it will consult on and then deliver an agreed package of changes to reform the UK's AML and CTF supervisory regime and improve the effectiveness of the money laundering regulations. And true to its word, on the 30th of June this year, HM Treasury published a consultation regarding the reform of the UK's AML and CTF supervisory regime, which is open for 3 months and closes at the end of September. A consultation on amendments to the money laundering regs is expected to be published in Q4 of 2023, according to the plan. Moving on to the next slide, please. So the plan notes that crypto asset transfers are an attractive enabler for criminal activity, given that they provide a near instant and low cost way to transfer value across borders. Following ongoing consultation, the government will set out plans to regulate crypto asset activities, which we dealt with in detail in last week's webinar in case you're interested in what these changes to the regs will be. However, the plan notes that regulation is only part of the response, and the government will also establish what it calls a new crypto cell, which will combine law enforcement agencies to pool expertise and enforcement tools to tackle the criminal abuse of crypto assets. And the plan is for law enforcement training pathways to produce and maintain a pool of highly skilled investigators and intelligence officers. And set timescales for the establishment of this multi-agency cell are within Q4 of 2023. So finally, moving on to the last slide in my section, which is SARS reform and asset recovery, and I'll touch on these very briefly. So in terms of SARS, suspicious activity reports, it can be said that private firms have been viewed as a critical gateway to the provision of financial crime intelligence through the mandatory SARS regime since the enactment of the money laundering regs. The plan states that in financial year 2021 to 2022, over £300 million was denied to suspected criminals as a result of SARS. A reform of the SARS regime commenced in 2019, and the plan makes clear that changes to the regime will continue to be made across the lifespan of the plan. The steps outlined to improve the SARS regime include the rolling out of a new electronic SARS portal and expansion of the Financial Intelligence Unit, which sits within the National Crime Agency and is responsible for analysing and processing SARS. And finally, in terms of asset recovery, the plan notes that reforms brought by both the Asset Recovery Plan and the first Economic Crime Plan have led to record asset recoveries under the Proceeds of Crime Act, amounting to £354 million in financial year 2021 to 22, which apparently is the highest figure on record. However, despite improvements, the government recognises that this represents only a small portion of laundered funds, and it's committed to continuing to recover proceeds of crime. To this end, a new anti-money laundering and asset recovery programme will be established with the aim of increasing intelligence, investigative capability, and delivering improved technology. And through this work, it's envisaged that more criminal proceeds will be recovered. The government also proposes to increase the headcount of the Crown Prosecution Service. So that brings us to the end of my half of the session on outcome 1 of the Economic Crime Plan. I'll now pass you on to Sylvia, who's going to cover the activities that fall within the remaining 2 outcomes in respect of sanctions and fraud.
Thanks, Marianne. Good morning, everyone. Okay, so moving on to the second outcome under the Economic Crime Plan. So the government is setting itself the outcome of combating kleptocracy and driving down sanctions evasion. So it's not surprising to see sanctions feature as part of the second iteration of the EC plan. As the plan itself highlights, since the last 3-year economic crime plan was published, the geopolitical context has evolved. One of the most notable examples of that being Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which resulted in the UK and other regimes increasing the deployment of complex financial and other economic sanctions. And the UK government views the Russia-Ukraine conflict as part of a growing threat posed by kleptocracies. Before I go any further, probably best to set out the definition of a kleptocracy. It's on the full definition taken from the EC plan itself is listed on the slide there. So a kleptocracy is a highly corrupted political regime where power has been consolidated for the benefit of a small elite. Kleptocrats exploit often open financial centres and professional services and developed economies to help corrupt elites enjoy their ill-gotten gains overseas. There's a more fuller definition on the slide there. So the UK government feels that more needs to be done to address kleptocracy and the underlying problem of high-end money laundering linked to corrupt elites coming through the UK and other global financial centres. Before the beefing up of sanctions against Russia, Russian individuals were legitimately holding assets and wealth in the UK. And since sanctions against Russia were strengthened, the scale of Russian wealth in the UK has become clear. And such deep-rooted involvement in the UK financial system could undermine and pose a threat to the security of the financial system. So what is proposed to tackle this threat? If we go on to the next slide, please. So the EC plan outlines how the UK government has already begun to combat kleptocracy with its sanctioning of over 1,500 Russian individuals and entities. It has also grown the number of employees of the Office of Financial Sanctions Implementation, OFSI, to over 100, and it has established the National Crime Agency's Combating Kleptocracy Cell. And the government intends to build on this work by improving collaboration between the public and private sector, and by providing guidance and support to all relevant sectors. And it also intends to expand the capacity of all of that new NCA's Combating Kleptocracy Cell. Some of the guidance envisaged will include an assessment of sectoral threats and identifying vulnerabilities relating to financial sanctions, This will principally be done by OFSI. There's also a commitment to maximise new UK resources and capabilities, and part of that will be done by improving engagement and information sharing of breach cases between the statutory supervisors. That includes the FCA, the professional body supervisors, and OFSI. The government also intends to work to enhance cooperation with the US, EU, and other jurisdictions to increase the effectiveness of financial sanctions. And this will include utilising the Russian elite proxies and oligarchs task force. That's a task force which brings together international partners to ensure the effective enforcement of financial sanctions being implemented. There's also a commitment to support cross-government work on criminal breaches of sanctions and working in partnership with agencies around the world to target individuals and deny assets. The UK, alongside other countries, is actively considering all possible options for seizing assets that could be used to remedy the harms caused in Ukraine. This may lead to further policy development and possibly expanding the Proceeds of Crime Act. So one to watch out for there. The government has also set itself the action of ensuring that the UK is proactive and clear in its public-facing communications, that the UK is not a home for dirty money. So again, we'll see how that develops. So these are just some of the actions proposed under the plan. And in terms of delivery, some work is ongoing with delivery dates projected for this year and others projected for 2024. Those more international focused actions have longer implementation periods and are projected for the year 2025 into 26. So moving on to the third outcome of the plan, which is a commitment to cut fraud. And we're on the next slide, thank you. The government has a forthcoming fraud strategy, and in the EC plan, it highlights that it has already committed 100 million of new money over the next 3 years to tackle fraud. And through this new strategy, it intends to pursue fraudsters by disrupting their activities and bringing them to justice more often and quicker. It also intends to block frauds at source by dramatically reducing the number of fraud and scam communications that get through to the public. But where frauds do get through, it intends to empower people to recognise, avoid and report frauds and equip them to deal easily and appropriately with those frauds that do manage to get through. Again, the plan sets out the existing work which has been done to date, including the launch of the new Public Sector Fraud Authority, which was introduced in response to the increasing risk and exposure to fraud faced by the public sector. And the new Public Sector Fraud Authority sits at the centre of government and reports to HM Treasury and the Cabinet Office. In terms of future developments, the government has proposed actions of overseeing the performance of ministerial departments and public bodies and working with them to improve the understanding of risks and taking action on fraud against the public sector. To meet these actions, it will agree fraud management performance metrics and action plans with ministerial departments and key public bodies. It will also carry out targeted reviews of areas of fraud threat and quality reviews of fraud activities, and it will collect performance data on progress against the metrics set. The Public Sector Fraud Authority also intends to work with partners in other countries to share and develop leading practice, standards and guidance in fighting fraud against the public sector. And that will be through the International Public Sector Fraud Forum. In terms of delivery dates, the milestones for cutting fraud are spread across the 3 years of the plan, with some work envisaged to be ongoing and in some cases with an annual delivery date, so renewing each year. Of course, the activity to cut fraud is not confined to the actions that are set out in the fraud strategy or those by the Public Sector Fraud Authority, but the measures that Marianne has already discussed, including those on crypto assets and the changes with regards to Companies House, are also intended to tackle fraud. So we've now covered the 3 main focused outcomes of the Economic Crime Plan. And if we just go on to the next slide. So I just wanted to discuss a little bit about the public-private collaboration piece. So as we often find when it comes to economic crime initiatives, the EC plan raises a somewhat valid point that collaboration between the public and private sector is critical for tackling economic crime. And although there has been progress to date, more can be done. The plan also recognises that whilst there exists a vast amount of information across the economic crime system, some of it sits siloed in different organisations and different formats, with unclear legal and technological gateways for sharing. However, the proposals under the Economic Crime and Corporate Transparency Bill, as well as recent reforms to the UK's General Data Protection Regulation, more commonly known as GDPR, should remove the legislative barriers to economic crime data sharing. So therefore, in the plan, the UK government makes a statement that intends to capitalise on those removal of barriers to increase data sharing. And it also proposes a new public-private economic crime data strategy. So that's intended to enhance the exploitation of available data to better prevent, detect, and pursue economic crime. And the delivery date for the data strategy is targeted to be in the latter half of this year and into 2024. So that could be quite a useful tool. So if we just go on to the next slide. So coming on to the final part of today's session, and the key question, does economic crime plan to go far enough? Well, the plan sees itself as ambitious, and there certainly is a lot of bold wording in there at least, but effectively tackling financial crime is a huge challenge. And we've seen that from the figures that Marianne set at the beginning. There's a lot to it. There's a vast amount of money that was needed to tackle it. And particularly as there has been underfunding and lack of resource for the past decade or so. So whilst it's a step in the right direction, the plan does appear to be largely reactive rather than proactive. It's mostly based on previous year's figures rather than anticipated future crime. The plan doesn't seek to preempt new trends or establish how the government might deal with new methods or trends that may emerge in the 3 years that the plan will be in place. So it may well have missed a trick there. Also, as we've touched on, the estimated figures of losses to fraud are estimated to be in the billions, and economic crime more broadly costs the UK hundreds of billions each year. And under the plan, the government has committed to a funding package worth 400 million over the 3 years to 2026. Much of that, as we've heard, will be raised from the new economic crime levy, raised directly from those firms which are considered to pose a higher risk of being exposed to money laundering. We don't yet know fully more about what that 400 million will be spent on, but we will know a little bit more when the government's 10-year fraud strategy and anti-corruption strategy are published. But what is clear is that the UK government is continuing with the trend of placing more responsibility on the private sector in the fight against financial crime. Private sector firms can therefore expect to continue to grapple with more compliance measures, and there will be less places to hide for any non-compliance. So it's probably right that effective tackling of financial crime will stem from effective public-private sector collaborations. So I would welcome more private-public initiatives where expertise and knowledge can be leveraged, and certainly more guidance from regulators and supervisors on the expectations of the private sector will be valuable in ensuring resources are properly allocated. And data sharing, as the plan itself highlights, will also be key, and seeing a more joined up approach between supervisors and regulators would certainly be welcomed by firms, I think. So that is as much as I'd planned to say on Economic Crime Plan 2. So I'll now bring to a close today's, and indeed all of, our FS Academy Summer Series. Marianne and I hope you've enjoyed today's session and the others if you tuned in for those. If you didn't get a chance, this and all of the other sessions will be recorded and available to watch back. And we hope to see you again for probably our next horizon scanning session, likely in the autumn. So do look out for that. We hope to see you then and have a great day.